Okay, last time we talked about the first part of Chapter 2, structure and function of the neuron and neurotransmitters. Today we're going to talk about the brain and brain structure and function, covering the old and the new brain, lobes of the cerebral cortex, and the specialized functional areas of the cerebral cortex. Be sure to also review your independent module on lateralization. There's a link that's called Brain Parts Song by Aaron Wolf, Aaron Wolf, Wolf. And if you type that into YouTube, it'll take you to a brief song that actually is kind of an accurate summary of the function of the different brain parts. So it can help you kind of remember all of the things we're going to talk about today. This is just an overview, so you shouldn't try to write all of this down. It's just to kind of orient you to what we're going to cover. Basically, we'll cover the oldest part of the brain first, which is the medulla and pons, which constitute the brain stem. Next, we'll move to the thalamus, and then to the reticular formation, which are two kind of equally primitive but very vital parts of the brain. Then we'll look at the cerebellum, and after that we'll move to the limbic system and cover the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and the hippocampus. So the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and the hippocampus are the three parts of the limbic system. So the brain stem basically is the medulla and the pons, and the medulla is important in automatic functions of the brain, and so heart rate, breathing, and so on are really the domain of the medulla. And you can see from the diagram that medulla is really no more than a swelling of the spinal cord. A lot of people wouldn't even think it was considered part of the brain. The pons, which is also just above the spinal cord, is very important in broad sleep and wake cycles. So it's part of what helps you stay in kind of a circadian rhythm of sleep and waking every day, even if you didn't have any external cues of night or day. The thalamus is located deeper within the brain, and what the picture shows on this page is a cross-section of the brain. It's as if we've cut the brain in half so that you can see the inside of one of the hemispheres. And if you look deep within this hemisphere toward the middle of the segment, you'll see the thalamus, which serves basically as a relay center of senses. In other words, it takes information on senses like vision and touch and relays them to the appropriate part of the higher brain, which is the cerebral cortex. The reticular formation is actually a system. It's not one particular part, and you can see it in orange in the diagram. It basically runs from the spinal cord all the way up through the pons. And so the reticular formation is a system of arousal or consciousness. Reticular formation is what's important in kind of changing fluctuations in arousal that you feel every day. On top of the brain stem is the cerebellum. And the view that you're getting here is the underside of the brain. In other words, if we took the head off and flipped it upside down, you're looking at that upside down portion of the brain, kind of looking at it from that perspective. And the cerebellum are those two kind of striped or striated lobes that you see at the back of the brain. And this is an old drawing that dates back to the 1500s, which tells you how long people have been interested in brain structure and function. Just another view of this cerebellum for you. And again, this is kind of in normal or proper perspective. We're looking a little bit underneath the brain, and you can see the lobes of the cerebellum, which look completely separate from the brain. The cerebellum is extremely important in coordinating fine muscle or motor movement. The limbic system includes the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, and the amygdala. The amygdala controls emotional reactions to stimuli in a very primitive way. And so, for instance, the amygdala would help you determine whether you should run when you see an image coming towards you. The hypothalamus is in charge of the 4 F's: food, water, fight, flight, and fornication. In other words, hunger, thirst, aggression, fear, and the sex drive are mediated by the hypothalamus in a very crude way. And it sends impulses up to the higher brain centers, which kind of dampen the responses and make them more socially appropriate and more complex. And finally, we have the hippocampus, which is also part of the limbic system. The hippocampus is absolutely critical in helping us form new memories, as we'll see when we move into the memory chapter. It's particularly important in spatial memory, which just means memory for things like how objects are placed in space. For example, remembering how to get to the store. If you've got a store that you go to on a regular basis, you know which way to turn to get there, and that's partially dependent on spatial understanding. The new brain consists of lobes of the cerebral cortex and then specialized functional areas of the cortex that overlap with these lobes. So the lobes basically are the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. And we'll go over these in turn, so don't worry about writing all of them down right now. We'll start just kind of with a diagram. The frontal lobe is in the front part of the brain, so kind of over your eyes in the front of the head. The parietal lobe, if you put your hand on top of your head and feel kind of the flat part of your head, scoot it back a little bit, then your hands over both parietal lobes. The occipital lobes are in the very back of your head, and then the temporal lobes are, as you would guess, by your temples. And since we have 2 hemispheres, we have 2 frontal, 2 parietal, 2 occipital, and 2 temporal lobes. So let's take a look at the function of these lobes. The frontal lobes basically govern all of the functions that differentiate us from lower animals. So anything that allows you to kind of forecast yourself in time, to use language consistently, to make complex decisions, and to sequence fine motor movements, all of that is controlled in part by the frontal lobe in conjunction with other brain areas. As a case study, there's a decline in reasoning and impulse control that we see in the case study of Phineas Gage that we mentioned earlier in this class. And we know that part of his decline in impulse control, his more aggressive behavior, was caused by damage to the frontal lobe. And if you make your PowerPoint full screen on the non-audio version, or if you just kind of copy and paste the link below into your browser, that's another way to access the short video on Phineas Gage. And his case study is interesting. It's one of our first case studies and did have fairly extensive damage to the frontal lobe and a specialized part of that called the prefrontal cortex that resulted in a lot of personality change, inability to plan the way that he was before the injury, and a loss in kind of social appropriateness. Some related research on frontal lobe function was also gained by a researcher named Goldman-Racek. And what Dr. Goldman-Racek found is that monkeys that she compared that had more highly developed frontal lobes had a better capacity for problem solving. So the more advanced a species of primate was in terms of frontal lobe development, the more it could do things like hold images in memory and do abstract problem solving. Humans similarly show similar deficits in problem-solving abilities when they're young because our frontal lobes are still developing all the way up through adolescence. And so we know that all those connections between the frontal lobe and the limbic system, for instance, are still in development even in middle school times. So we're not born with the same problem-solving abilities and the same abilities for impulse control that we have when we're older. The prefrontal cortex is particularly interesting to psychologists. It's closest place that we could say that personality is involved in, because if you have damage to the prefrontal cortex, what makes you special and unique, what makes you you, would probably shift fairly radically. It's involved in subtle aspects of social judgment, decision making, goal setting, and planning, so extremely important in higher intellectual functioning. Second, the parietal lobe, which again is kind of on that flat part of your head. If you scoot your head back toward your hand, back a bit toward the back of your head, it's important in body sensations like touch, temperature, and pain. And if you have damage to that part of the cortex, even if the nervous system itself, in terms of peripheral nerves, are undamaged, you may still have problems with sensations in the affected part of the body. Next, we go to the temporal lobe, which again, these temporal lobes on both hemispheres are kind of close to the function that they govern, and that's kind of interpreting and giving us the ability to sense auditory information or hearing. And finally, in the back of the brain rests the occipital lobe, which is extremely important in visual processing. In fact, a condition called visual agnosia is the inability to recognize objects, and usually results from damage to the occipital lobe and other related areas of the brain like the frontal lobe that help the occipital lobe interpret visual information. Now, there are three areas of the new brain also that line the cortex, and these are not separate from the lobes. They overlap. We just talk about these areas because they're a little more functionally specialized than those broad lobes that we talked about. So the sensory, motor, and association area have particular functions. The sensory area is mostly in the parietal lobe, and if you remember parietal function, it should be no surprise that it's involved in sensations, touch, sight, and sound. In fact, the somatosensory cortex, which you can see in the diagram, is particularly attuned to body senses, touch, pressure, pain, and temperature. The motor area, and motor always means voluntary movement in psychology. This motor area is in the frontal lobe, and it controls voluntary movement, not just the ability to do it, but the ability to do it in a planned fashion. The association areas in the frontal and temporal lobe. Anytime you see frontal lobe involvement, you know you're going to be talking about higher functioning. So no surprise that here we see the highest functions, thinking, speech, reasoning, and higher mental processes are the domain of the association area. Now, if you like, if you're more attuned to visual learning, there's a link called Brain Anatomy and Functions. You can just type that link into YouTube and take a look at the areas that we just talked about, kind of a nice little recap. And that finishes Chapter 2 for us, and the next thing that we will have is an exam in this online course.